Hi guys, David here with another science update. So today I want to talk about the topic of the number of hours that PhD students in STEM typically work to complete their degrees. And I'm going to talk about it sort of in a broad way, and I'm also going to talk about my own personal experience. And it's always kind of painful to reflect on these things. Probably it is for me, and I think it is for probably other STEM PhD graduates or dropouts, because basically there's a lot of dysfunction just around the concept of work and productivity in academia. So the article starts off by asking, is the long hours culture of academic organic chemistry laboratories finally changing? He says, going to graduate school in the physical sciences doesn't have to be an awful experience, but the truth is that it's often a less than delightful one. You'll probably get a more accurate account by talking to people who are in the first few years past their degree while their memories are fresh. With time, the usual reworking goes on in memory, with the worst moments fading a bit and the better ones being reinforced. It's also entirely possible that someone who is nostalgic for their PhD studies is largely remember being back in their mid-20s and missing that instead. And so actually, it just so happens I think I'm in a pretty good position to talk about this topic for two reasons. One is I am just about a year out from finishing my PhD. And the second reason is that, unlike a lot of people, I actually took, at certain portions during my PhD studies, rather detailed notes on the number of hours I worked and how I spent my time during those hours to, in some cases, quite a degree of precision. So he says in the article, it has to be said that different research groups have different cultures, and that's completely true. In fact, there's probably more difference from research group to research group when it comes to work expectations and culture than there is from maybe like university to university. Some of these research groups make it easier to succeed or at least survive, but others definitely do not. He goes on to say, this has sometimes led to tragedies. There is no small number of suicides in the history of chemistry graduate studies, along with less noticed suicidal thoughts, attempts, partial breakdowns, and bouts of depression. Even the brightest and most accomplished can find themselves wondering if they're up to this job or if they've perhaps made a serious mistake with what they had thought would be their life's work. Some kind of come out of this experience stronger, but others are damaged by it. And anyone who's been through a graduate program will have seen examples of both. That's true. You know, I've seen people really crack under the pressure and leave graduate school in way worse shape mentally than when they entered it. That's really not rare. But I've also seen people who have really like blossomed and developed and become much stronger and better people. He says there's room to believe that all this is changing a bit. More and more younger professors are at least paying lip service to the idea that the old guard methods of running a research group aren't necessarily the style to aspire to, and some of these older professors themselves are seemingly mellowing with age. He says, with any luck, there may also be some recognition that there are many different styles of thinking and of work that can all contribute to a research effort, and that not everyone has to be a hard-charging 20-hour-a-day dynamo at all times. That phrase there is... Nobody works 20 hours a day. I have worked 20 hours in a day, and I've seen other people do it. I have worked all night, but nobody works 20 hours a day that I have known. And I even know a guy that has that rare, I think it's a genetic trait, where he only has to sleep 4 hours a night. He doesn't work 20 hours a day. Nobody does that. So that kind of hyperbole is common. You know, people talk about, oh, you know, I work 100 hours a week consistently. No, you don't. You might even be at work 100 hours a week consistently. That would be something like 17 hours a day. That's probably possible. But there's just a lot of hyperbole surrounding the amount of hours that academic researchers work. What I observed is people would work really, really hard for a short period of time, maybe like a week or two, to get something done maybe, or try to accomplish a particular task, and then they would burn out and they would like slough off. Or what would happen more often is they would maybe like keep on making themselves keep up that same pace of attendance. You know, they'd be at the lab or they'd be in the office, but if you watched, you know, they might spend like half the day playing computer games. And I'm not judging that at all. It's just that it's actually, it's probably impossible to work well 100 hours a week. And I know that Elon Musk supposedly does that, and maybe he does, but he's also the richest man in the world. And I don't think there's many Elon Musks in the world. And I actually really dislike this. I'm kind of like triggered by this, I guess, because I really don't approve of the glorification of this sort of approach. Kind of like the let me just like totally burn my candle out kind of approach, where you're going to just invest all of your life into one thing, and if it doesn't work, then you'll just die, and if it does work, then you'll have glory, like a death or glory kind of thing. I just think that's kind of a bleak way to look at the world, and I'm saying that as someone who is very prone to that thinking, right? Like, I think part of the reason why this phrase is making me so angry is that I find it really tempting to try to adopt that mindset, but I know that it's self-destructive. He finishes the article by saying, a young scientist should finish a degree tired but happy, not depressed and wondering where they went wrong. And actually that phrase there just really reminds me of this book. I never did read this book. I've heard it was good, but this book was published in 2010 called Surviving Your Stupid Decision to Go to Grad School. This is a book for dedicated academics who consider spending years masochistically overworked and underappreciated as a laudable goal. They lead the lives of the impoverished, grade the exams of whiny undergrads, and spend lonely nights in the library or laboratory pursuing a transcendent truth that only 6 or 7 people will ever care about. These suffering, unshaven, sad sacks are grad students, and their salvation has arrived in this witty look at the low points of grad school. That's hilarious. I never did get around to reading that book, but I've heard good things. So before I dive into my own experience in depth, I just want to say that there are probably a few things that are worth bringing up when it comes to the topic of the number of hours that grad students work. And again, this is coming from someone who just finished his PhD just a year ago, and I worked closely. I had a cohort of people that I was with, and I got to see them. I got to see roughly the number of hours that other people worked, though you never know for sure. And I got to see sort of the successes that they had, and the ones that kind of burned out, and the ones that did really, really well. I did not really see anyone work over probably 70 hours a week consistently. And I went to a pretty good school. I did not go to MIT or one of the very top universities, but I went to quite a well-respected research university in a college within that university that was publishing a lot and getting a lot of respect internationally. And so I don't know for sure if my culture of my department was up to par with the very, very top, but we're quite a strong group. I say that just because I think we might be representative of what's going on kind of broadly, at least in the US, and I could be wrong about that. But like I said, I didn't really see anyone consistently work maybe over 70 hours a week or so. I think everybody would sometimes work that much for a while, but oftentimes there was more of like an uneven distribution. So people would work a lot, and then they would kind of like slow down for a while, and then they would work a lot more, and they'd slow down for a while. So that's one thing. The other thing that I want to bring up is that there's a difference between working and being present physically. And I do think that what I observed was the people who worked long hours, and some of the ones who didn't work long hours, would intersperse their productive work with kind of like low quality downtime at the office or near the lab. In other words, you'd see people like watching a movie during the day because they're really stressed out, and to be honest, they're decompressing or playing video games or just kind of inefficient, wasting a lot of time. In my case, a common feature was that I would take a coffee break or so, or a couple of coffee breaks a day that would turn into like hour-long discussions, which was really fun actually. But the point is that we were at work for a certain number of hours, but we weren't really working the entire time. And I do think that contributes to sort of a couple of things. One, that contributes to people inflating their sense of of how much they actually work, kind of like this romantic, like, well, I worked 70 hours a week, kind of like this masochistic culture thing. And the other thing is that I think it's really actually a byproduct of kind of a culture of toxic expectations, which is to say that the culture, the assumption of your professors is that in graduate school you should be working yourself to the edge of physical and mental illness. And if you're not doing that, there's something wrong with you. And so you want to be present and you want to work consistently a lot. But the reality is, this is what I observed, especially people around me, is that a human just isn't really meant to be, as the article put it, a hard charging 20-hour-a-day dynamo. That sort of energy, that like dynamic kind of energy, doesn't come from a place of sort of like fear of being let go, or fear of not cutting it in academia, or fear of being humiliated. I think that sort of energy comes from a place of health and ambition. And I do think that ironically, like the expectations that you should be working yourself to the edge of mental and physical illness actually make this energy all the more rare in people. So in talking about my own overall experience when it comes to the number of hours worked in graduate school, I'm going to look at 3 different sources of data, and I actually gathered a fair amount of data on myself while I was in graduate school. It's a little bit meta, but I think when you're a science and data oriented person, you just start to sometimes you just start to gather data and assemble data on things that maybe people would find a little bit weird. But basically, I'm going to look at 2014, 2016, and 2019. Those are 3 different time points. 2014 was the full year before I went to graduate school. 2016 was the first full year of graduate school. And then 2019 was my last full year of graduate school. And I don't have data for those full years, but we're going to kind of look at a snapshot of the number of hours I worked. And so 2014, as I said, was before I went to graduate school. What this does is kind of give us a baseline. And so what we have here is we have the date, and we have the projects that I was working on, the description of the work I did, the status of the work package, and then I have the estimated time to complete a particular project, and then the time it actually took to complete an actual project. And then in this column E, we actually have kind of clustered for each group. The 7 is the number of hours that I worked on the 10th of January 2014. And you can see as you scroll through that I was extremely consistent about tracking my time. And generally speaking, here's a day that I worked 5.7 hours. But generally speaking, I was working between 8 and 9 hours a day, with an occasional time working slightly less than 8 hours. So yeah, it's a little bit, I recognize it's a little bit weird probably that I track myself this closely, but it is interesting to see that, and it is also kind of cool to see what I did. So it looks like, so I had a professional job, I should say that, in 2014. I worked for 4 years in between my undergraduate and my graduate studies, and so let's see, I was reading white papers, I was researching funding sources, I was writing grants, I was doing cool work. So that kind of gives you a baseline. So that was just like a normal guy with like a normal full-time job. I was pretty ambitious, but what I did was I would funnel my ambition into working more efficiently rather than working longer hours, partly because that was kind of the office culture where I was as well. So you have an occasional, 12-hour day or something like that, but generally speaking, 7, 8, 9 hours a day. And I got a lot done, and I had really good reviews. So then let's get into my first full year of graduate school, or at least the data that I have. And you know what? It's not that different. Like, it's a little bit more, but these are hours that I actually worked, right? This is not just like going in and twiddling my thumbs or something like that. And generally speaking, okay, so I've got some long hours. You get some 12-hour days, but generally speaking, after all of the fuss and after all the hyperbole and like everybody's working like crazy, it ends up being maybe slightly more. So I'm seeing a fair amount of 11 to 12-hour days, but lots of 7 and 8s and 9s. Here's a couple 6s. That makes sense, I up there I had some 11s, and now down here I have some 6s. It's almost like you end up psychologically compensating, for periods of harder work by sloughing off, as if there was maybe a limit to which a human being can really push themselves, because this is actually actual work I'm recording, not just like sitting and playing Tetris or something to decompress. But I will say this is that this, which I think is normal and appropriate, kind of working 7, 8, 9, maybe 10 hours a day, is healthy, is good. I felt a lot of pressure to dial it up more, and so I would work longer hours, but then the quality of my work would go down, and it would end up averaging out to about the same amount of productivity. What I found as time went on is that I went through periods where I worked more, like I was saying. So even though I was kind of like striving to be like more of a steady sort of person, just the culture of it is that it kind of gets to you, the expectations that you should be, as I said before, sort of like working yourself to the edge of your mental and physical health. Ironically, what I found was I went through periods where it backfired, where I actually ended up being less productive than I was in 2014. And you can see that really well in 2019. I wouldn't say I had a breakdown or anything like that, but I really, just check this out. This is in August of 2019. You can see I'm working like 2 hours. So I went to work. What I'm trying to say is I went to work a full day, probably more. Probably I was probably at school for more than 10 hours. And here's August 27th, 2019. I sat. This is what I got done. Think about job prospects and do some online research. Get more deionized water. See if 23-1/23-2 is soluble in chloroform or dimethyl sulfoxide. It's not. The samples may have degraded from being in the vacuum oven. Sad face. So that's like what I got done. So I will say that the culture of graduate school, where you're doing all this extra work, or the expectation is you're gonna kick butt all the time. Oh, here I got my life back together for a day, and I managed to eke out like an 11-hour day. But the following days I worked 7 hours and then 4 hours. So I really think that the culture of that overwork is really overblown. And I actually think that, at least in my experience, and I did observe other people, you get people into like procrastination phases where they'll, they're still there, but they're like they're at work, but they're procrastinating. They're like checking their email 50 times a day, or playing Tetris or something like that. So I actually found that the quality of my work overall, the average quality of my work, was highest when I was before I was in graduate school, in a more sort of encouraging environment where people were just trying to get things done and make money. Which, I mean, that sounds very cutthroat in its own way, but it's very cut and dry. It's like, well, we're doing well, we're making money, right? Versus this sort of like open-ended, you should work 12 hours. 12 hours is kind of a minimum, right? You should be working 16 hours. And if you aren't, then there's something wrong with you. At least in my own personal experience, it actually backfired. So I would be at the lab, or not at the lab, but I would be at the university for long hours, relatively speaking, longer hours than I was before. And as time went on, I got less and less efficient. Now I would turn it around for periods of time, and I would be quite productive. And overall, I was what would be considered a successful grad student. I had very high grades, and I had 3 first author peer-reviewed papers, which is pretty good considering that my research group was a new research group. So we had to actually kind of like build our lab up, and we didn't have any like standard operating procedures, and we had to do all that. But all that being said, I got all that work done in terms of actual working hours in less than full time. That's right. That's the bottom line. I really believe I'm not the only one. I don't think I'm the exception. I'm just someone who has actual data on my actual hours worked. I worked on average slightly less than full time during my graduate school, during the 5 years of my PhD. And in some cases, significantly less than full-time. In other cases, significantly more than full-time. And I do think that at times I was highly efficient, but more than times that I was highly efficient, I think I was highly inefficient. And I think that this culture of all work and no play, that sort of, even if you don't have a professor who's like really driving that down your throat or anything, the backdrop is that the expectation is unrealistic. So you feel like you're always failing. And when you feel like you're always failing, that is actually highly demotivating. And so actually, now I don't have the data with me because it's on my work computer, but I also track my time at my full-time job as a research scientist in industrial laboratory. And I am back to working 8 hours, 9 hours. Occasionally I'll work 10 hours, but really more because sometimes I like to come in early because it feels really good to succeed. And I'm also doing really well in this industrial laboratory as a research scientist. I've been exceeding expectations and all that. So basically, before graduate school, I was exceeding expectations. While in graduate school, I always felt like I was failing. And even though I have results that show that I didn't fail, that's just sort of the feeling that pervades most graduate students, is a sense of inadequacy and feeling like you're always failing. And now after graduate school, I am excelling. So, is that me? Did I change while in graduate school? Or is there something about the culture of graduate school which is basically demotivating? And I actually think it's the latter. I do think that the culture of graduate school is demotivating. I sort of coped with it in different ways, at times going through like procrastination and things like that. And other people coped with it in different ways, and other people didn't cope with it. And that's just a thing. But I think that basically we should just forget about this long hours culture, because I don't think it's effective. I think that if people were to, like I did before graduate school and after graduate school, if they were to say, you know what, I am going to work a maximum of 10 hours a day, and I'm going to be very efficient at it, and I'm going to take weekends off, except for, occasionally I'll come in if there's something I need to, a reaction needs to be quenched or something like that, but I'm just going to come in for 2 hours maximum. I think that people would get more done. I think that if you're trying to be effective in a graduate school context, what you could do is try to focus on eliminating the ways that you're wasting time. And if you did that, I do think that would be way more effective than just this sort of, well, let's just like work longer hours. Tim Ferriss has said that work has a tendency to expand to fill the space allotted to it, right? So if you're like, I'm going to work 12 hours a day, then you will find that the work will expand out and you will spend more time doing things, or you will actually start doing unnecessary or low impact things. Instead, if you go in and you say, you know what, my time is limited. What are the 3 things that would be most impactful for me to do? And then you got those done and you left after 8 hours or 9 hours maybe at most. I think that if you spend a year doing those 2 different things, working 12 hours a day versus working 8 focused hours a day, the 2 scenarios after a year would be completely different from one another. So in conclusion, I think that if you are going to be a graduate student, I think that you should try to assess what the culture of the group that you're going to join is. And if it is one of these masochistic cultural situations where where the grad students look underslept and really stressed out, I would not do it. I would just skip it. I would go find a different group. What you should do is, if you go to graduate school, I would focus on working really efficiently and giving yourself nights and weekends off. And maybe if you feel ambitious, if you want to get up early in the morning, that might be a good approach. But I would really limit the hours that you work to something around maybe slightly more than what's considered full-time in the US, or 40-hour work week. But be really careful about pushing it past that, because I think that the more you give yourself over to this masochistic kind of culture of abuse, I think that it will make your life worse and it will make you less effective. So this is just one opinion, but I am, as they said, I'm pretty fresh from graduate school, and if this article is to be believed, you'll probably get a more accurate account by talking to people who are in the first few years past their degree while the memories are fresh. So I don't know if this is helpful in any way, or maybe entertaining. Maybe you can at least enjoy hearing about my suffering. So anyway, if you enjoyed the video, I'd appreciate it if you would like and subscribe, and I hope you'll join me again in the future soon. Bye.